Friday here on the North Shore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined by Brian Batko. We're going to talk about what to expect for this final Steelers preseason game against the Lions 1 p.m. Saturday in Detroit. But especially what's to be expected of the offense, because we've been hearing more and more about what's expected and if this is a winnable plan that we're seeing from the quarterbacks and from Arthur Smith. We'll talk about that, who to look out for at wide receiver, and who to look out for in the secondary as those groups try to make the final 53-man roster. All here on the North Shore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello, welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined by Brian Batko, one of our great Steelers beat writers here at the Post-Gazette. And as always, you can find all our written work at post-gazette.com. You can find all of our podcasts on your favorite podcasting app or right here on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as our daily content that comes out here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, including Chipped Ham and Football, our Tuesday podcast hosted by this man here, Brian Batko. Brian, we are now just one day away from the final preseason game, the last day of football being played that doesn't actually matter for the regular season. There's excitement in the air for things to just get real here, and I have to say I am sharing in it because I just want these teams to get to week one.
Yeah, I certainly feel that sentiment, Chris. I do too, but I would also say this is one of the more relevant preseason games we've seen in quite some time for the Steelers, at least preseason finales, because we know they used to just be, you can watch the first half maybe and then tune out for the rest. But because of the Russell Wilson, Justin Fields factor, whether you think there really is a quarterback competition or not, I think it's still going to be instructive to see how both of those guys look for the short term and the long term. And even beyond that, another storyline we pounded all week on this show and others is the offensive line and how that unit responds to a rough go of it against Buffalo.
Absolutely. And we'll get into other parts of this. But of course, the topic in Pittsburgh that everyone's wondering about is the quarterback position. Now, if you've been following along, we've been reporting all throughout camp. Russell Wilson still is the guy slated at QB1. But it does seem like both Russell Wilson and Justin Fields are going to get extensive looks here in this final preseason game. And like you said, normally this is where you'd see Kyle Allen come in and throw a bunch of bombs and just try to show what he can do as the third stringer, and maybe some J.R. Plumlee as well. But I don't think we're going to get much of that. It seems like we're going to see this. And Justin Fields, I thought we had some interesting talks with him in the locker room Thursday afternoon after their practice. But I think he's kind of acknowledged that, like, he's shown his improvement. He's taken those steps, and he's still looking to improve. He doesn't mean he's not focused on this game. But in your story that you wrote, which by the way you can read at post-gazette.com if you want to get the latest story on Justin Fields written by Brian Batko right here. He said, quote, "I think I've shown what I can do. I think the time I did have with the ones practicing in training camp, I think that went well. I think we grew a lot each day and every day, but at the end of the day, it's not up to me," talking about who's going to get the job there. Brian, at some point, the Steelers need an offense that doesn't rank in the bottom 5 in the league. And the goal, of course, of this year is for this year to take a step towards that. It's not going to be like one of the best offenses in the NFL, but if they can even get to the middle of the pack, that'll do a lot. Do you feel like with what you've seen with the dink and dunk asks of these quarterbacks and the limited things that we've seen in this offense that there is a chance for this group to at least ascend to the middle of the pack? Or do you feel like the way that what they're asking to protect the football first and play the kind of football that they're asking these guys to, that this is kind of dooming them to stay in the same bracket they've been in?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you this much. I think there's a better chance of increasing the ceiling if it's Fields back there instead of Wilson. There's also probably a better chance of the bottom falling out completely if it's Justin Fields back there, because we've seen some highs and we've seen some not so highs from him thus far, not just this summer, but on his regular season NFL resume. Obviously the win-loss record, not very good his time in Chicago, but there's more that is baked into that than just Fields. But I still think there's a lot of people who look at him, what he did with the Bears, even what we've seen from him in limited action in the preseason. And I might even count myself in this category, worried that he's just one of these guys who has everything, but he just doesn't have that it factor for whatever reason, the clutch gene, whatever you want to call it. Russell Wilson's been the opposite of that his whole career. He doesn't have really any of the physical attributes that you think of in a prototypical NFL quarterback, other than the arm size and pretty good mobility when he was younger, at least. But he's just had that moxie about him, that ability to make winning plays from the get-go. So I just think it really remains to be seen. If he still has some of that left in the tank, then yeah, maybe elevate this Steelers offense. But I think one issue with trying to kind of follow the same vision and identity that they've established in recent years is if you don't have an offensive line who's going to just absolutely maul other teams and create big running lanes and control the game, control the clock on the ground, then I think your ability to play the way you want to play and dictate terms like that it's just not going to be as good as it looks on paper.
I agree. You're putting yourself, behind an 8 ball there. I mean, the Steelers have survived that way, but I think everyone's kind of waiting for when will be the times for this organization to not just survive, but thrive in whichever way. Because here's the other thing. If the Steelers can be a defensive-led team that can get 12, 13 wins, be in serious competition to win the division and host a playoff game, I think people would be all for that. But the thing is they've been in this position for a while, and they haven't really pulled themselves up much higher from it. Now, at the same time, it's also acknowledging they've been doing a lot of rebuilding, especially on the offensive side of the ball. They've been one of the least expensive offensive units in the NFL for, I think, 3 years now. So
Right.
all that plays into it as well. But I think that it's kind of going to be interesting to see when we've heard from Arthur Smith this week about what they've been asking their quarterbacks. Russell Wilson talked about it on Wednesday about how, like, hey, I know that we're in preseason, we're trying to move the ball. I'm not trying to throw the ball through a super tight window early in the game when we're just trying to move the ball and figure things out. In the fourth quarter, that would be different. But, hearing from those guys and even from Justin Fields about balancing when to show off that arm of his, I think it's still an interesting conversation of what is more important. Is it more important for this offense that's not the highly invested part of this team to just have a higher floor, or for them to actually take a shot at getting to a ceiling that makes them much better?
Yeah, I mean, that's what Mike Tomlin has to weigh here above all. And they do that in all sorts of facets when you're drafting a guy, when you're picking a starting quarterback, when you're calling a play in the moment, right? Are you going to take a check down and play it safe and play field position, or are you going to go for the gusto and try to move the chains on 3rd and 12? These are the decisions that football games are won by and teams are, built or deconstructed by, right? So yeah, I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see how he does kind of announce this starter. Maybe he won't, Chris. Maybe after this game, there's that week in between where they'll make the roster cuts and pretty much have an off weekend, and they'll all level up and reset. But game week in Atlanta, if nothing is said, I can imagine Mike Tomlin being asked about it Tuesday, and he'll just say, Russ has pole position. Nothing has changed. And it's like, all right, Mike, does that mean he's the starter? Yes. It's like, okay, that's not really naming a starter in a really, in a classic football coach way.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's gone on this long, so there must be something to it. And yeah, obviously it's not going to determine the entire fate of the season, but we all know that it would behoove the Steelers to get off to a good start against a couple of rebuilding teams in their own right in Atlanta and Denver.
Absolutely. We'll get more into those games when we get closer to there. But I want to talk about this preseason game. We talked about how the first team offense is going to look like the second team offense with Fields. But let's talk about some of the position groups where I think guys are battling for their place and their futures on this team in the NFL. We'll do that next here on the North Shore Drive podcast for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Brian Batko. Stick with us. We'll be right back. We're back here on the North Shore Drive podcast on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Brian Batko. Brian, let's talk about the receivers for a minute. Now, we're not talking about Brandon Ayuk because he's still not a Pittsburgh Steeler, and nothing's happened. And despite what anyone's telling you, nothing has happened. The Niners and Ayuk are still in talks for whatever they're about to do. The Steelers presumably going to go into this NFL season. George Pickens as their one, Van Jefferson, Calvin Austin, Scotty Miller, guys, Des Fitzpatrick, guys like that beneath him. Roman Wilson still hasn't returned to practice from injury, so we don't know what's going on there. But looking at this situation, Brian, and seeing how things have kind of played out, I think we can all presume Van Jefferson is going to be the wide receiver 2 for this team. What is your feel for? Is this the Steelers settling, or do you think that this is just kind of them just being who they are right now, but maybe preparing to make a move in the coming weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I just think I like what I've seen from the receivers in practice and camp, and maybe it's one of those situations where, George Pickens looks so good that he kind of increases optimism by himself, and it's not as if Brandon Ayuk is here right now practicing against these guys day in and day out, right. So it's kind of tough to gauge their value compared to obviously the games and stats and everything that he's put up over the last couple seasons. But I mean, I just can't think of many instances where I feel like Van Jefferson doesn't look like he has it, or he looks like he's going to be a real weakness. He's not catching the ball. Most of these guys have acquitted themselves fairly well, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that receiver core takes shape beyond those two. I mean, I think Calvin Austin is not really in danger of not making the team. Third-year guy who's only in his second year for all intents and purposes because of that rookie year injury. But fourth-round pick who, at the very least, I mean, he gives you a wrinkle to throw out there with his speed and burst. So I think he's safe. But then it'll be interesting to see how they decide. And Roman Wilson, he'll be on scholarship, if you will, by virtue of being a third rounder who just got off to a rough start with the injury. But Des Fitzpatrick, Quez Watkins, Scotty Miller, they've all had good moments. Can all three of them make it? Probably not. Two, maybe. I think one for sure will be on the 53. But man, I mean, I wouldn't want to be the guy deciding which one, because they're all pretty different skill sets. Justin Fields today was saying he feels bad for anybody who has to cover Scotty Miller one-on-one because he makes people look foolish on the field. And I would have that same take from being in St. Vincent College for 3 weeks. He had some good some good catches to help out his quarterbacks the other night in game. Mm-hmm. Des Fitzpatrick, sort of an in-between guy. He's willing to play special teams. Like, he's just a work hard guy that will try to run down, tackle somebody. Yeah, good gunner. He'll run down and tackle somebody if he has to. He probably has worse hands than Scotty Miller, but he can get open too in his own right. And then Quez Watkins is like a deep ball specialist. Justin Fields talked about his ability to track the deep ball. He was probably wishing it was him in the end zone the other night instead of TJ Luther on the overthrow that's been talked about ad nauseum in Pittsburgh this week. So yeah, I mean, different skill sets. A guy like Brandon Ayuk probably gives you all three in one, but that's why he's an all-pro, and that's why he's going to get big money here or elsewhere. So I think the Steelers are in a decent spot at wide receiver. If the value's right, they'll try to upgrade. But I think this offense can move effectively with these guys, provided they've got good protection and good quarterback play.
I feel you on that. I think that's there's potential on this roster right now at the wide receiver position that, I think people have downplayed, if that's the right term for it, because of, they're unproven. This isn't an offense that's flourished in several years. And there's been a lot of hoopla around this team potentially adding a wide receiver to the mix here. But I feel you on Van Jefferson. That's a guy who, he took the AB routine, of post workouts at training camp, catching 300 passes a day. Calvin Austin's shown his speed. And to your point about, Scotty Miller, that's a guy who he's shown his ability to get that separation. When Justin Fields talks about that, it's because he's not lying. Like, he's really been a good contributor in that department. And I do think it comes down to what are the most important roster spots for this team? Is it to have that extra receiver? Is it to have that extra gunner? Or is it to have that extra lineman? Because, we've seen the offensive line take some serious injuries this year already. And, I think that there's questions that are still remaining there at wide receiver. But I guess the question that I have for you
running back, even an extra running back with Jalen Warren nicked up, an extra tight end. We know how often Arthur Smith likes to use those guys. The defensive line, I mean, that's another one where it's going to be tough to get a top 6. I mean, I'm not saying that unit's great or anything, but it's hard to distinguish between like numbers 5, 6, and 7. Does Mark Robinson or Tyler Matakevich or both make it for their special teams ability at linebacker? I mean, there's a lot of equations like that go into actually forming the 53, and people out there can say, well, who really cares who the last 2 or 3 guys are on the roster? But those guys can be thrust into game day roles if they're active and if injuries hit. So it can matter in the end.
It can. And I think
at receiver, they probably don't have 2 game changers, but they've got one in George Pickens. How many teams do have 2 game changers legitimately at receiver? I mean, Miami, Philly, for sure. I guess you could argue Tampa Bay, but I mean, it's hard to have that much invested in San Fran, but they don't right now because one of them is holding out because he wants to go somewhere else.
And so are the Bengals 1-2 punch with Jamar Chase.
The Bengals are a good one too.
Yeah. And supposedly Jamar Chase wants $40 million according to reports out of there. $40 million a year for that. We'll see how that plays out. But but to your point about do you need 2 star receivers? Not the last time, excuse me, but when the Steelers have been a top 10 offense in the past decade, and at least in 2014 and 2016, 2 of those years that they did that, their number 2 receivers those years were either like Marcus Wheaton or Eli Rogers. So like they've shown the ability to score. Now, again, like that's also an offense with Marquise Pouncey and David DeCastro, with Le'Veon Bell, with Antonio Brown. But I think when you go and you look at how much Pickens was able to show, even with bad quarterback play last season, you give him, if Russell Wilson and or Justin Fields, whoever is starting at quarterback, can be a solid quarterback who gets you the ball in those points, I think George Pickens can be a fantastic number 1. And if he is, and Pat Fryermuth's doing well, and Najee Harris is doing well, and Jane Warren's doing well, then you don't need the number 2 wide receiver to be some superstar. You need them to just make the tough play and get open when you need him. I think that's the kind of stuff Van Jefferson's working on right now. Doesn't mean that the Steelers aren't in the market. Doesn't mean that they're not looking at options out there. But I do think that they're not in this panic mode about the wide receiver position that some people want to make them out to be.
Yeah, I guess I should have mentioned Houston too. They really loaded up at receiver.
Oh yes, they did.
And we've seen that. We've seen all those guys hurt the Steelers.
Yes,
regular season, preseason, with the Texans, with the Bills. So but not every team can have the trio that they've got down in Houston, and a lot of other teams are just hoping they can find complementary guys who are good enough to step up and keep opposing defenses honest.
Absolutely. I want to talk about the other side of these guys, though. That's the cornerback position. Let's talk about them and where we see those guys, and not just the cornerbacks, but the defensive backs, because it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out and who gets those final roster spots. Could special teams play a factor? Find out all that here and more on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter and Brian Batko. But first, I want to remind you, this show is also brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. They're your mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them today for a free consultation. That's Savinas, Kane, and Gallucci. We're also brought to you by Moon Township Honda, where you can get your new Honda today. Just go to 5802 University Boulevard in Moon Township, Pennsylvania, or visit their website, moonhonda.com. Again, that's 5802 University Boulevard, Moon Township, PA, at moonhonda.com. Here's a message from our friends at Moon Township Honda.
To build the Honda CR-V Hybrid, we took everything you love about the CR-V and kicked it up a notch with greater power. For a CR-V unlike any before. Adventure confidently with Honda, car and driver's most awarded brand in 10 best history. The CR-V and CR-V Hybrid, part of the Honda line of rugged vehicles. Visit your local Honda dealer where new vehicles are arriving daily. Buy online or reserve from select Honda dealers.
We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, Brian Batko. Brian, let's flip to corners real quick. Well, let's flip to defensive backs in general, but let's start with corners here. Beanie Bishop missed the last preseason game with an injury. He acknowledged that, he feels like he's ready to go, but coach, calls the shots there. what is your expectation for how the final cornerback room will play out here at the end of the preseason? Do you anticipate 5 corners to stay, 6 corners to stay? Because Beanie Bishop is an undrafted free agent rookie that they signed, and at this point in time, it looked like he might be the guy that starts at the nickelback position.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this much. On Tuesday, it was when we asked Terrell Austin about sorting through those nickel options, and he basically just said there's not much to sort because whoever's healthy that day gets it. I mean, on one hand, that's good for those guys, but on the other, you don't want your defensive coordinator saying you're getting a job by default. That could be a bad sign for you in the end. So, I mean, I think Beanie has been I think he started off really hot for sure. This injury is obviously throwing a wrench into things, and it's going to be a position where I think the Steelers owe it to themselves to probably look on the waiver wire.
Mm-hmm.
And for somebody like Thomas Graham, who's played inside and outside, that could be a benefit for them. That could be a benefit for him to potentially make this roster, because I think with Joey Porter, Dante Jackson, Corey Trice, I would put those 3 as the definite top 3 outside corners on this roster.
Agreed.
And then after that, I think they'd probably pick 2 more, and maybe they're both inside capable guys, because I don't know that those other 3 have played much, if at all, in nickel, except for Trice in certain packages.
Yeah.
And that's not his body type, really, to begin with. They'd be trying to kind of shoehorn him in there to probably get him on the field.
Right. It'd be forcing the issue a little bit there. But
Sean Elliott can help in the slot. That's that's a benefit, but you still got to have some guys who are doing that full time.
Right. And that's the thing, is I think the Steelers, they could platoon the answer, as far as finding multiple options there. But I really think that is something that they're certainly facing that has not gotten any easier on them when it comes to slot coverage, especially because you want to keep your best corners on the outside. You want to have those guys playing out there. I think the ultimate goal they want is for Corey Trice to line up on the outside. But like you said, if you're only getting limited chances to see the guys in the slot, I think it kind of hurts their chance to solidify anything there, and for the defense to feel solid there. Now, I asked Deshaun Elliott and Minkah Fitzpatrick and other guys about Beanie Bishop throughout camp, and then even in since they've returned from camp, how they felt about Beanie, and they said he's taken things well and he's understanding, and he's and Beanie also talked about how they're coaching him up to teach him how to disguise different things, and he's willing to learn. All those are good signs, Brian. But I think the Steelers just have a tough choice. They want to stick with, do they want to stick with just 5, or do they want to go 6 here? Because again, we're talking about, these different position groups, who they should keep. When you keep an extra one somewhere, someone's got to go somewhere else. And that just makes me wonder if cornerback is the right group to either add to or take away from.
And then, I mean, even keeping it under the defensive back umbrella, if you keep 4 safeties, then, I mean, obviously Minkah Fitzpatrick and Elliott are 2 of them. I'd be shocked if Monte Casey isn't the 3rd, because of the way they like to use him in that 3 safety look. And Miles Killebrew, I mean, he's a safety by position.
Right.
We know he's going to be here for his special teams value. So if you only keep 4, then that means you're parting ways with 6th round rookie Ryan Watts, and you're potentially losing him to a waiver claim from another team on cut down day. And I don't know that they want to do that. I get the feeling that they like Ryan Watts and the ball of clay that they have to mold there. So yeah, I mean, this is this 3rd preseason game, which used to be the 4th preseason game, is always a big opportunity for guys. I guess without that 4th preseason game now, Chris, we won't hear the annual Mike Tomlin anecdote about Stephon Logan returning kicks and forcing his way onto the roster at the 11th hour.
Don't push our luck, Brian. We're probably going to hear it after the game now.
You might be right. But I mean, hey, some of that, in fairness, can be applied still to the 3rd and final preseason game, because maybe the 3rd and 4th quarter, somebody who doesn't have a spot locked up right now tips a ball, brings in a ball, punches out a ball. You probably got to make a play on the ball to force your way into the discussion. But yeah, I mean, you've got to be opportunistic in these chances. You've got to give the coaches a reason to feel like they can't risk losing you. And that's obviously easier if you're a younger guy, if you're a cheaper guy, if you're a draft pick. But it'll be really fun to watch the competitions at receiver at corner. We didn't really talk about running back because of Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, and Cordero Patterson, an entrenched big three. But can somebody like Jonathan Ward or LaMichael Pirine really just show like, hey, I'm a valuable guy to have here in case of injury? I might be inactive on game days if someone's not hurt, but all those guys will have an opportunity to try to stamp things for themselves on Saturday.
Absolutely. We'll be covering all of that here.
The earliest preseason game the Steelers are playing since 2016.
Wow.
Didn't it feel weird to have a 1 p.m. preseason game? Like
it does.
And lo and behold, I have never covered a preseason game that early. So
it does feel weird, but it also feels right because now we won't
like
be
it
up until 3 a.m. at night.
I like it. I like it.
I like it too. I also think it's going to be interesting to see, with the intensity that Mike Tomlin's talking about, how long do they keep that up? If they do keep that up at all with this final preseason game. There's a lot of things to cover here still as they get to this preseason game. We'll have all your final looks at the Steelers at post-gazette.com. Brian, thanks so much for joining us here on the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Read all of our work at post-gazette.com. Excuse me. Find us here every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on the North Shore Drive podcast. We'll be back. Of course, we will be back Monday breaking down what we saw in that Saturday game, 1 p.m. You can tune into it on all your local stations, but we'll be covering it. Jerry Dulac will be on hand writing about it. We'll have our thoughts on the Monday episode of the North Shore Drive podcast, which will be just ahead of the final cutdown day for the Steelers and who's making the 53-man roster. Get all of that and more at post-gazette.com. We'll see you again here Monday on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.